Thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Jen Bernstein. We want to welcome to the program our first guest up this morning, Senator Chris Murphy, who's in Washington right now. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's talk about the latest relief bill that has passed the Senate. It passed the House, $484 billion in aid. What's Connecticut going to get from this?
Well, the majority of this bill is new money for the Small Business Grant Program. This was a program that ran out of money about a week ago. There are thousands of Connecticut small businesses that were able to get up to $10 million to be able to stay open or to continue to pay their employees. There was such high demand, we had to come back and approve a second round of funding. This is really important because lots of small businesses in Connecticut want to continue to pay their employees, and this is the mechanism by which they can do this, getting this grant from the federal government. There's also funding in this bill for a national testing program. The president has essentially refused to run a national testing program. He's left it up to the states. And so this is Congress in a bipartisan way forcing the president to do something that he didn't want to do on his own. So there's about $30 billion in this bill to start developing a national testing program so that we can be testing both symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. And then finally, there's additional money for hospitals. Our hospitals are just stretched absolutely thin right now, and we need more relief in Connecticut so that we can continue to hire more nurses, to replace those that are very war weary, and also to buy more supplies.
How are they doling out the money to states? What's the formula here?
So in this bill, the money goes to the Small Business Administration, and the Small Business Administration is using private banks to do these loans. And so we have dozens of small and regional banks in Connecticut who are giving out the loans. They will now be replenished with an additional $250 billion. The money going out to hospitals goes out according to formulas that are based upon the number of cases that states have, or based on the amount of patients that are coming into these hospitals. So Connecticut will receive more than its fair share. When you look at the loans that were approved, the small business grants that were approved in the first round of funding, Connecticut got a big portion of those grants, and that's good. That's going to help a lot of businesses in Connecticut be able to survive this crisis.
Yeah, I know Governor Lamont had said some 15,000 Connecticut businesses had been frozen out in the first round, and the state was really looking forward to getting this money. And we know that by earlier or the end of this past week, you were supposed to be able to apply. What's your recommendation to businesses that are not in the queue yet, and to businesses who applied but were waiting to hear?
Well, the application should be open now that the Senate and the House have passed this legislation. We assume the president will sign it, but we may need to come back and authorize even more funding. My commitment is to make sure that we have enough money so that every single small business that applies and is eligible can get this funding in order to stay open and operating. Now, listen, there have been some problems with the program. I've been critical of the program. What we're learning is that, frankly, banks have been rewarding their existing customers. A lot of very small businesses, sole proprietorships have been shut out. To be honest, Jen, I recommended doing this program a different way. I thought that the Department of Treasury should give out the grants directly so that banks couldn't play favorites. I'm going to continue to press banks in Connecticut to accept new customers, to not give priority only to their biggest customers and biggest borrowers. We've got to make sure that every single business, whether you have 200 employees or whether you have 2 employees, can get aid through this program.
Yeah, I know we had talked last week during our discussion about this, and you had been on the phone with Connecticut banks and were concerned that certain businesses were getting left out, some of the smaller businesses with banks. This new round of funding, though, doesn't really put a lot of stops in there. So are you just able to take their word for it that they're going to be more aware and try to help out? Well, are there safeguards in place for your concerns?
Well, Democrats really had a laundry list of changes we wanted to make in this program, again, to make sure that it was fair, to make sure that the corner gas station was getting a grant, not just the chain restaurant. Republicans didn't accept most of our changes. Unfortunately, in the Senate, Mitch McConnell is in charge. But we did get one provision added. We have a set aside of $60 billion that goes to small community banks. These are the banks that have only one or two branches, that have the accounts with your local mom and pop businesses. So we were able to make sure that a portion of this funding is going to go to small banks, which we think will give the best chance for that money to go to those truly small local businesses.
What's the latest on negotiations for this next stimulus bill? We know that the one that just was passed in the Senate and House last week was more of a replenishing, they're calling it 3.5, but the fourth stimulus bill, I know you all are pushing for help from states. It's been met with some resistance by Senator Mitch McConnell especially, who says he doesn't want to bail out blue states and suggested that states consider bankruptcy if they've been in financial dire straits before, which Connecticut has been. We have a pension problem here. So what is that looking like? What are the negotiations shaping up to be right now?
Well, what Senator McConnell said is just unconscionable. What he essentially said is that because this virus has inflicted more pain on states with Democratic governors than on states with Republican governors, he's not interested in helping. That's just a stunning admission. Maybe part of me is glad that he said it out loud, but frankly, it shouldn't matter whether this virus is hitting states that have one party's governor or another party's governor. It doesn't discriminate here in Connecticut, depending on what party you are. And the fact of the matter is, Connecticut balances its budget every year. It's the federal government that doesn't balance its budget. And Connecticut's going to have a hard time balancing its budget this year, not because of anything Connecticut did, but because the virus has hit us hard. And President Trump has essentially refused to run a nationwide response to coronavirus. So the state of Connecticut and the state of New York and the state of Massachusetts have had to expend enormous resources to do it themselves. And so all we're asking is for the federal government to make sure that the citizens of Connecticut don't get punished because the virus happened to hit us. And frankly, I don't understand why all of a sudden this has become a political issue for Senator McConnell. We are going to push hard for this fourth package to have funding in it to help states beat this virus. And if the president's not going to run a response out of the White House, then he's got to at least be willing to help us in places that have been hard hit run the response ourselves.
Well, we know that Connecticut might balance its budget every year, but it's not without its problems. We have a huge pension liability issue in Connecticut. And so I know people were saying that they didn't want to bail out states for things that had happened previously. Some people in Connecticut saying that, Connecticut's financial state is before coronavirus is its own fault. But of course, Lamont also talking about the deficit that we're seeing and saying that about 85% of it right now is because of a loss of revenue directly from the shutdowns with COVID.
Yeah, listen, I think it's worth saying again, Connecticut balances its budget every year. We make tough choices to balance that budget. Lots of states have difficulties doing that every year. But the reason that we are in the position we are in today is because of a lethal pandemic that has attacked our state. And we now have a Senate Majority Leader who's saying that because that virus is inflicting more harm on states that vote for Democrats for governor rather than for Republicans for governor, he's not going to support funding. I'm not going to let that stand. If this virus was hitting Republican states harder, I'd be pushing just as hard as I am now to make sure that the federal government steps up and does the right thing.
All right, so Senator Murphy, I put out on my Facebook page some questions for viewers out there since we have a little bit of more of a long form interview here. And there was a lot of questions about more help for individuals down the line. John asks, can you please ask if he knows anything about extra money for people that are unemployed and going broke? Thomas asking about the new stimulus that you all are negotiating right now. He said that there's talk of $2,000 a month for 6 months or a year that the House is proposing. I hadn't heard this yet. Is there any chance of that happening for the working middle class affected by this pandemic? Basically, it brings up the question, is more individual help coming down the line? Because, we have businesses closing, there are people that continue to file for unemployment. Is the stimulus that just went out towards individuals' pockets going to be enough?
Well, I haven't made any secret of the fact that I don't think these stimulus checks are big enough. I had proposed, along with several of my other colleagues, a much bigger program whereby we would put $2,500 a person in the pockets of Americans, and then we would send out automatic checks on a quarterly basis if unemployment didn't return to normal levels, so that there could be some certainty of funding continuing to come into families throughout this crisis. I'm glad that in the relief package that passed 2 weeks ago, we did supersize unemployment benefits. So if you lose your job now, you are eligible for $600 more per week compared to what you would have been eligible for prior to this crisis. And we extended unemployment benefits so that they can last 4 months longer. But we are going to soon be at 15 or 20% unemployment. Even if we turn the corner on coronavirus in the next month or two, that pain is going to last with us for a long time. It's going to take us months and months in order to recover that kind of job loss. And so we're going to have to look at much more broader, much more comprehensive stimulus measures. I think it's probably time for us to step up to the plate and invest in infrastructure. Let's take this crisis and put people back to work to do something that we know we need to do anyway, which is rebuild our roads and our bridges and our high-speed networks. So we need to keep the unemployment benefits going. I think we need to increase the amount of money that are going out to citizens and families in these stimulus checks. And then we probably need to engage in some broader spending that both puts people back to work and makes investments in the economy that we need to make no matter what.
All right, in terms of more questions that were on my Facebook page, there was a lot here about you criticizing the president. A few feel that you're highly partisan, that you criticize the president no matter what decision he makes. Norbert writing, regarding this COVID outbreak, are there any decisions made by President Trump which you can also agree on? What's your response?
Well, on the limited occasions that the president has used his authority to try to command manufacturers to make more ventilators and more masks, I've applauded him for that. I just think that he hasn't done it enough. If the president would allow his public health experts to run this response, we'd be in a very different place today. I have regularly applauded the work being done by some of those experts, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Redfield, and others. The problem is, on most days, the president is putting his political interests first and the public health interests of the country second. So I have been a critic of the president, but I think that's my responsibility. I think he has let this country down. I think he's let our state down. And if I don't point out the places where I think the president has failed this country when it comes to beating this virus, then I'm not sure how there is any pressure created for him and his administration to do better. So I think folks that know me know that I don't pull a lot of punches, that I call them like I see them. And I think that this president has been a failure in his response. He needs to do better, and I'm going to challenge him to do just that.
So one of your criticisms was about China, and there was an interview on CNN you did that gained national headlines, and it also gave a lot of criticism, or created a lot of criticism for you, and people wrote about it as well. There was a response on my Facebook page, Joe asking, please ask Mr. Murphy if he still believes, quote, the reason we are in this crisis today is not because of anything China did. David asking why you're defending China against the United States. I want to give you a chance to answer to them.
Sure. Well, people should go back and watch the actual interview rather than taking 6 words out of it. What I said in that interview is what I continue to believe, that China made mistakes, that the World Health Organization made mistakes, but none of the mistakes that they made necessitated 100,000 Americans dying. This virus was going to hit the United States, in part because China hid it from the world and didn't give us a head start in trying to develop treatments and vaccines. But the reason that this has become such an enormous, unstoppable epidemic in this country is because the president denied the extent of the problem for months, that he refused to stand up the kind of national testing, tracing, and quarantine program that we need and that we needed months ago. And the reality is the president was the primary cheerleader for the Chinese response in those early days. As many international organizations were trying to get China to open up, were trying to get them to share more data. It was President Trump in January and February who 12 different times praised the Chinese response to the virus, praised their transparency. And so there were a lot of people that were trying to get China to be more decisive. And it was President Trump that was making their job much harder. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around. But this idea that only China is to blame, when we had the ability to make smart decisions early on that would have prevented this crisis from at least reaching the scope and scale that it is today, I just think is a false narrative. And we need to call out the president when he tries to absolve himself of responsibility by finding other scapegoats.
I want to make sure, because we're running out of time right here, that we get this in, because I was reading that you co-authored legislation with a Republican senator that has to do with supporting students with disabilities. What's the status of that at this point, and what exactly does it entail?
Yeah, I think it is remarkable how much bipartisan cooperation there has been in Congress. I'm critical of the president, but I, frankly think by and large, my Republican colleagues in the Senate have been very responsible and have stepped up and passed relief package after relief package, and all of that has been done with broad bipartisan support. This initiative you're talking about is one that I've undertaken with Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. He's a very conservative Republican from the Deep South, and we have proposed a plan to try to help students with disabilities. A lot of students with disabilities are home right now. They really can't be helped effectively through distance learning. And so we've proposed a new fund of money that would help states catch up these kids once they return to the classroom, and some protections for these kids to make sure that they don't fall too far behind while they're out of school. So I am proud of the fact that we have found a lot of ways to cooperate and work across the aisle. The president hasn't made that easy, but I'm proud of the fact that on this issue and many others, we've been able to reach some bipartisan consensus.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy, I have more questions for you, but we are out of time. I appreciate your time, and please keep us updated here on The Real Story.
Thanks, Jen.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy right there. Coming up, we're going to talk with Bristol Health's CEO and president, Kurt Barwis. He came down with COVID-19 while he was trying to manage this crisis. He's now feeling better, and he's going to talk to us about his experience and how the hospital is doing today. Stay with us.